The grip of drought that is intensifying in the West has led scientists to turn to an unusual ally in the fight to limit the effects of climate change. We're talking about the largest rodent in North America, the beaver.
The river was dying. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the slow, invisible way that ecosystems collapse when no one is paying close attention. The water table had dropped. The banks had eroded. The floodplains on either side had dried into cracked, pale ground that hadn't held moisture in years. The insects were gone. The fish had thinned. The birds that depended on both had moved on or simply disappeared. By most scientific assessments, this stretch of degraded waterway had passed the threshold. The conventional wisdom was clear. Rivers this far gone do not recover. You can plant trees along the banks. You can restrict grazing. You can monitor the water quality for decades. But what was lost? The complexity, the web of life, the living architecture of a healthy river system, does not simply return on its own. That was the understanding. That was the accepted story. Then someone placed 76 handmade structures into the water. And something no one fully predicted began to happen. To understand what came next, you have to understand what a river actually is, not as a line on a map but as a living system. A healthy river does not simply flow. It meanders. It spills. It slows in certain places and accelerates in others, and in that variation, it creates habitat. Wetlands form in the shallow edges. Sediment deposits build islands. Willows take root in the soft banks, and their roots hold the earth against the current. Water table rises. Meadows grow wet. Species colonize every layer of that wetness, from the mud at the bottom to the surface where dragonflies rest on still water in the late afternoon sun. The word scientists use for this is process. A river is not a feature. It is a process. And when that process breaks, when the channel cuts too deep, when the water moves too fast, when the banks collapse and the floodplains disconnect, the entire cascade falls apart. For most of recorded ecological management, the response to a degraded river has been engineering. Concrete structures. Rerouted channels. Planting schemes. These interventions are expensive, they are slow, and their results are, at best, partial. A river can be stabilized. It cannot, in most cases, be truly restored. The thinking was reasonable. It was backed by decades of field data. It was also, as it turned out, incomplete. The crack in the conventional model did not come from a laboratory. It came from paying attention to an animal that most people consider a nuisance. Beavers are the largest rodent in North America, and for most of human history in the developed world, they have been managed out of waterways rather than welcomed into them. They block culverts. They flood roads. They fell trees that people would rather keep standing. By the 1800s, the fur trade had reduced North American beaver populations from an estimated 60 to 400 million animals to fewer than 100,000. And with the beavers went something that almost no one noticed at the time: the most sophisticated water management infrastructure in the continent's ecological history. What beavers build is not simply a dam. A beaver dam is a living structure, one that backs water up into the surrounding land, raises the water table, creates wetland habitat, and slows the movement of sediment and nutrients down a river. Over time, a beaver colony does not just alter a stream. It redesigns the hydrology of an entire landscape. The ponds they create become magnets for species. The wet meadows that form around them support plants and insects that support birds and mammals that support apex predators further up the food chain. When the beavers were removed, all of that went with them. Researchers and restoration ecologists had known this for years. The question was how to use that knowledge in a landscape where beavers were either locally extinct or where reintroduction was politically complicated. And that question led, eventually, to an experiment that looked, at first glance, almost absurdly simple. The technique is called Beaver Dam Analogues, or BDAs. The concept is straightforward. If beavers are not present in a damaged watershed, you build what they would have built, by hand using natural materials: wooden posts, woven willow branches, stacked vegetation. Structures designed not to permanently redirect the river, but to mimic the natural intervention a beaver family would make over the course of a season. The idea had been tested in small-scale pilots in the American West, in parts of the UK, and New Zealand. The early results were promising but limited in scope. Then came a project that changed the scale of the question. 76 of these structures were installed across a degraded river system, each one positioned by ecologists and hydrologists who had studied the channel's behavior, its sediment patterns, where the water needed to slow. The structures were not meant to last forever. They were not engineered solutions. They were prompts, invitations. Small interventions designed to begin a process that, the researchers hoped, might eventually continue on its own. The expectation, cautious and measured, was that the structures might slow water velocity in certain areas, might encourage some sediment deposition, might, over several years, begin to raise the local water table in a modest way. What actually happened was considerably harder to explain by those terms alone. Within months of installation, something began to shift. The water, slowed by the structures, began to spread laterally, not flooding but seeping into the floodplain in the way river water is supposed to, the way it had not done in years. The sediment that had been racing downstream started to settle. The channel, which had been incising downward, cutting deeper into the earth and pulling the water table down with it, began to stabilize. In some areas it began to reverse. Then the plants arrived. Not planted. Not seeded by restoration crews. Simply present, willows, sedges, rushes, pushing up from ground that had been dry and compacted for years. The seeds had been there, dormant in the soil seed bank, waiting for moisture that the degraded river had stopped delivering. The BDAs had not introduced anything new. They had restored a condition. And into that restored condition life had moved. The birds followed the plants. Invertebrates colonized the wet margins. Amphibians returned to areas where standing water had not existed within living ecological memory. Fish moved upstream into sections of the channel that had been too shallow and too warm to support them. And then, in some of the project sites, something happened that the researchers had hoped for but had not predicted with confidence. The beavers came. This is the part that is difficult to frame without sounding like something other than science. But it is documented and it is real. In multiple river restoration projects using Beaver Dam Analogues, wild beavers, drawn by the slowed water, the growing vegetation, the changed hydrology, have located the artificial structures and adopted them. They have reinforced them with their own material. They have built adjacent to them. In some cases, they have essentially converted an artificial intervention into a living, self-maintaining beaver colony. The 76 fake dams had not replaced the beavers. They had, in some places, called them back. There are 3 ways to interpret what this means, and none of them is entirely comfortable to settle on. The first interpretation is the most conservative. This is simply ecology working as expected. Create the right conditions, and the organisms adapted to those conditions will find them. The BDAs created habitat signals, slowed water, growing vegetation, accessible food, and beavers, which travel widely in search of suitable territory, located those signals and responded. No mystery. Just biology. The second interpretation goes further. The degraded river had reached a state where natural recolonization was no longer possible, because the conditions that would attract beavers had been eliminated. The BDAs broke a self-reinforcing cycle of degradation. They did not simply provide habitat. They interrupted a collapse that would otherwise have continued indefinitely. The third interpretation is the one that makes ecologists speak more carefully, more slowly, and sometimes with a visible change of expression. We may have fundamentally misunderstood the threshold between degradation and recovery. We may have been wrong about which rivers are too far gone. And if we were wrong about that, the question of what is actually recoverable, and what tools exist to begin that recovery, is much larger and more urgent than the current model allows. This is the evidence that changed the conversation. In documented BDA projects, in the Methow River watershed in Washington state, in river systems across the UK and New Zealand, in degraded dryland streams in the American West, researchers have recorded measurable, verifiable improvements in water table elevation, channel geometry, floodplain connectivity, and species richness within timescales that traditional restoration science would have considered implausible. Not decades, years. In some cases, the first measurable changes appear within a single growing season. The technique is not universally applicable. Rivers with extreme incision, channels that have cut many feet below the surrounding land, present challenges that BDAs alone cannot resolve. The structures can fail in high-flow events if they are not positioned correctly. And the return of beavers is not guaranteed. The animals must be present in the broader landscape, capable of dispersing to the site, and not immediately removed by landowners who view them as a problem. But the scale of what has been documented is significant enough that a growing number of watershed managers and ecologists argue that BDAs should be considered a primary restoration tool, not an experimental curiosity, not a supplement to conventional engineering. A first response, low-cost, ecologically informed, and in the right conditions, capable of initiating recovery cascades that engineered solutions have consistently failed to produce. The official landscape of river restoration has not yet caught up to this. The gap between what is being documented in the field and what is being implemented at policy level remains wide. That gap is not unusual in conservation science. It is, in fact, one of the more consistent features of how ecological knowledge moves, or fails to move, into practice. If you want to understand why this matters beyond a single river, stand beside a degraded waterway in late summer. The channel is narrow. The banks are bare. The water, where it still flows, is warm and shallow, moving over a substrate of fine sediment that has filled in the complex gravel structures that fish once used for spawning. The air above the water is quiet in a way that riparian air is not supposed to be quiet. There are no swallows. No hatch of insects catching the late afternoon light. No sound of water moving around structure, only the flat sound of water moving fast over a featureless bed. This is not a remote landscape. This is what a significant percentage of the world's rivers now look like. It is the new normal that arrived so gradually that many people alive today have never seen what a healthy river in this kind of climate was supposed to be. The baseline has shifted so far that the degraded state has become the reference point. What the BDA projects reveal, what those 76 structures in a dying river began to suggest, is that the baseline can shift back. Not all the way, not immediately, not everywhere. But the directionality of the process is reversible in ways that the dominant management framework has not fully accepted. That is not a small finding. That is a revision of something that has shaped conservation policy for decades. If you are interested in the investigations where the evidence quietly rewrites the accepted understanding, subscribe because there is more of this kind of story than most people realize. The most significant discoveries are rarely the loudest ones. There is a question that runs beneath all of this, and it is worth sitting with. How much of what we call ecological collapse is actually ecological suppression? A living system held below its recovery threshold by conditions that are themselves the product of human decisions. The beavers did not disappear because rivers became inhospitable to them. The rivers became inhospitable because the beavers disappeared. Remove one element, and the system degrades to a state that seems permanent, until you introduce the element back or introduce something that mimics its function. The 76 structures were not the answer. They were a question asked in the language the river could understand. And the river slowly began to answer back. The plants that came up from dormant seeds in the soil had been waiting, in some cases for years. The beavers that found the artificial dams and began reinforcing them were not discovering something new. They were reclaiming something old. The water that spread back into floodplains that had been dry for a generation was not going somewhere it had never been. It was returning. What the official model of river restoration had called irreversible was not irreversible. It was simply waiting for the right kind of interruption. That is what those structures were. Not engineering. Not conservation theater. An interruption, precise, humble, and ecologically informed, placed into a system that still knew, somewhere beneath the degraded surface, exactly what it was trying to become. The river is still out there. Some of the 76 structures have been replaced by living dams, built and maintained by animals that were not there before. The floodplains are wetter. The water table is higher. Species that had not been recorded in that watershed for years have been documented again. The story is not finished. It may never be finished. But it is moving in a direction that the accepted model said it could not move. And somewhere in that fact is something worth carrying, that the threshold between loss and recovery is not always where we think it is. That what appears permanent is sometimes only waiting. And that the most powerful restoration tool in a degraded landscape might not be concrete or capital, or decades of managed intervention. It might be 76 posts and some woven willow branches, placed with care in the right places, by people who understood what the river had once been and believed it could remember. If you want to keep following the stories where the evidence points somewhere the conventional record hasn't arrived yet, subscribe and let me know in the comments which river, ecosystem, or hidden recovery story you want covered next.